G'day everyone and welcome back to Talking Leadership. This is Eric Perez and I thank you again for joining me on what is my second podcast on the issue of leadership. Today I have the great pleasure of being joined by Mr. Martin Bella. How are you, Mr. Bella?
Very well, thanks, Eric.
I should add for the listeners that I should be addressing you as Councillor Martin Bella. that's
I
that's
don't
uh,
think we'll bother about that, mate.
that's currently your full-time position, Martin, or are you doing other things?
Oh, look, it's regarded as a full-time position, but I still farm. I recently closed my physio practice, but I was starting to run out of time. I just don't sleep a lot. That's all. So,
Okay, now I can understand that. So let's get onto the questions here. So, what was your first, what you might call official leadership role, man?
well, mate, it goes back to childhood. I can remember we were a large family. I was the oldest of seven, ultimately, and there were times when mum and dad, we lived on a farm, had to go and do stuff. And you were left in charge of younger brothers and sisters. And, it was problematic because you had to keep them under control. And if you pushed too hard, they'd complain to mum and dad. If you didn't push too hard and something happened, you're in trouble with mum and dad anyway. So you had to learn to tread that fine line. And sometimes it was a combination of threat and bribery that got me there. Needless
So
to say, there were lots of failures.
it was your training ground then, I take it.
It certainly was.
Yeah, okay. So again, beyond the family role, what was your first paid leadership role? I guess I should be asking.
Well, it's hard to say because I had positions of authority through school, and then I suppose in sporting activities, I was either captain sides or was vice captain, and I actually found early on that I was more naturally suited to a secondary role at that stage, and the reason was I think sometimes my temper, um, being a bit volatile, wasn't conducive to a long term leadership role. Probably the leader was more of a diplomat, and I was more of I suppose you'd call it the warrior chieftain sort of thing. Um, but ultimately, you learn from that. And, over the years, you evolve.
Okay, so you've answered my partially my second question, which was what might drive you or what drove you, sorry, in the past to take on leadership roles. So you're saying you evolved from being the second fiddle to taking on a leadership role. What were the kinds of things that pushed you to take on the top job in any of the fields that you've worked in?
Well, one, you can't expect other people to do a job that you're capable of doing. Um, and if you want something done, you do it yourself. So what I did was, if it needed to be done, you step forward and do it. And if you saw someone there that was someone you could respect, someone you felt had, a tremendous capacity to achieve, then what you did is you tucked in behind and you became like a very loyal supporter. You were kind of like I don't know, just the hard man in behind, a person that could lead. And obviously, my early years leadership was involved in sort of conflict. I mean, it was a physical sport we played, a contact sport. Um, the biggest thing I think about leadership is you've got to realise your failings. I realised early on that I was a tremendous leader in a situation of conflict with a gung ho group behind me. But in a longer term sense, not a lot of people can handle sort of rigid discipline and focus for a long period of time, and people would start to become um, very skeptical of that, and they'd move away. So what I found was I used to have to pick my time to step forward, do the job, and then step back very quickly and just wait for the next opportunity.
Okay, so before you go on, just for the sake of the listeners, when you referred to your time as a sportsman, and just for those that aren't aware of what is the greatest game on the planet, which is rugby league, that you were an elite player not only at the club level but also in State of Origin. And for those that aren't aware, I'll make a link to some of those clips on YouTube just to give some sense of the level of sport at which you were playing at, which kind of brings me to the next question. So from what I know of you, and for the listeners, you were an elite sportsman. You're now working in the public sector as well as working in a farming background. In your experience, if you can you tell me, do you think there's a difference between leadership and management?
Definitely. I think it's always very handy when someone has both skills. There's no doubt at all. But those skills are never really, don't necessarily go one with the other. Management I see as a longer term issue. Leadership is something that can be a very short term thing, depending on the situation. A good manager is an asset if the leader cannot do it. A good manager is an asset to the leader. And I think this gets me to my very next point, and probably my most important point. My evolution towards leadership has been to realise that I have an ability to pick the right people, get them around me, and then get them to do what they do best. So I don't need to be the best at anything really other than assessing the people that I have around me and facilitating them to perform.
Okay, that's excellent. So here's one that stumps most people I've talked to in leadership roles, and I'd love to get your perspective on this. Leaders make mistakes. How do you engage in an environment where a mistake's been attributed to your leadership? How do you handle that?
Well, firstly, I'll get to the first bit second. The second is you've got to be smart enough to either repair the damage that your mistake has caused, or to get people in to repair that damage. But the first thing is to quite bluntly admit that you made a mistake. You do not make excuses, but you do give reasons. And I'll give an example of when I was first elected. Coming into council, I was firmly of a certain belief. When I got into council, we voted on that thing, and I actually voted to retain it rather than get rid of it, because I'd seen the figures. My initial assessment was based on incorrect assumptions and data. So once I made that assessment, I changed my view. Now, on a television interview with one of the news services, they said, you voted against to retain the measure. And I said, yes, I did. And they said, but before the election, you said that you wanted to get rid of it. I said, yes, I did. And they said, why? I said, because I was provided with the figures, I made an assessment, and my earlier view was wrong. And they said, but you blah, blah, blah. And I said, yes, I was wrong. And they said, but blah, blah, blah. And I said, for the third time, I was wrong. And I said, every time you ask that question, I will repeat quite comfortably, I was wrong. I said, but errors are not made better by doubling them up, by pursuing that error to reinforce your first error. I said, I realised the error. These are the reasons I realised it. I've changed my view and I've done it. Last time was an error. This time is a victory. So it pretty much ended the interview.
Oh, okay. So that's comes into the next question, which I think is a nice segue. What do you believe in your experience, again, as a leader, is the most difficult part about being a leader?
Obviously, the more people you have under you, the more motivations, the more, what would you say, unrest you'll have. I think as a leader, you've got to be able to decide what your aims and focus is and are. But then you've got to understand what is more important, the individual or the goal. And sometimes a leader, it's the old 90-10 rule or the 80-20 rule, 20% of the population takes 80% of your time. There's never been a truer word spoken. So ultimately, never be afraid to lose people that you don't need. Not everyone is going to be pursuing the goal for an altruistic reason. Many of them are going to be pursuing it for a very venal motivation. So to me, identify that, be aware that you need good people there, but don't sacrifice 10 good people for the sake of one. You definitely try and bring people along, but there comes a point. I was told very early on by someone, and it became very, very true. Never issue anyone with an ultimatum. And the ultimatum was, it's me or them. And I've adopted that ever since. If you were to come to me and say, it's me or them, and my reply is, we'll see you later. Because ultimately, you are the one creating the problem. The other person's down there. And that's not to say that I wouldn't then go and see what the other person was doing or whatever like that. But the person that issued the ultimatum is the person that's trying to force the issue and ultimately is not someone that's going to make for a cohesive group anyway. They're thinking more about themselves than about the organisation. So there's at least one person in that situation is going to go. And that's the person that issues the ultimatum. And then maybe it's the person that's caused the problem. And when I say maybe, there's nothing to say that a conversation with the person that's caused the initial problem can't be coached along and brought into line. But an ultimatum gets you nowhere.
Okay, so following on from that, one of the things that people see or want to see in their leaders is success. So again, for the information of the listeners, when I was growing up and I watched you and others play rugby league as an example, if you'd won a state of origin, it's easy to see that you won the game. That's a measure of success, you won the game. But from your travels, what do you think is a measure of success as a leader in your experience? Not just attaining the goal, not just attaining the goal.
No, I believe the measure of success is when the people within the organisation that you have tremendous respect for you return that respect. When you have tremendous respect for, return the respect. So, and I believe within the Green Shirts organisation, I have that. And ultimately what it is I've got many people there that will criticise constructively my ideas and the things that I propose. They don't just discount them out of hand, but what it does is it makes my ideas even better. And I know that person is doing it to help me and the organisation, not to advance themselves or drag me down or whatever. So ultimately, from my point of view, success is that respect that's shown. The other thing is that on the odd occasion where I've had to make a snap judgment or decision on something, and I've turned around to those people, and even where it wasn't hitting the nail right on the head, they've gone, good on you, Marty, like it was the best one that could be made at that point. So they're not there saying, oh, you should have done this or should have done that. They've respected what you've done. They've respected what your abilities are, and they allow you that bit of leeway that may well lead you into a certain amount of error. But as I always say to my people, if you make an error in trying to do the right thing, for the right reasons, I will back you. If you make that error for the wrong reasons, then I'll damn you to hell. So all I want from people under me is that they act for the right reasons. It doesn't have to be the smartest or anything like that. It's very easy to change people's ability, but it is very difficult to change people's heart. So I need good hearts, and then we develop ability after that.
Okay. Like to get your views, if I can, Martin, on a couple of statements here. So the first one is, on-the-job experience develops better leaders.
Look, I definitely think it helps, but nothing is ever set in stone, and there are always exceptions to the rule. You get people that learn quicker than others. So you can get someone with very little experience that can lead very, very well. And I think where that works is that they're willing to get the right people with that experience in underneath them and take advantage of their knowledge. But as a general rule, yes, I do think it helps. And I don't think there is absolutely no reason why a leader shouldn't every so often pull his suit off, pull on a pair of strides and a work shirt and dig a hole. Just to get a taste, because digging holes might have changed in the 10 years that they're a leader, if you know what I mean.
Yep.
So doesn't hurt.
Okay, next one. Formal education helps to build and develop better leaders.
No, I disagree with that. In many cases, I've seen formal education actually hinder good leadership, because when you look at it, how many of the people instructing people on how to become leaders are leaders themselves? Many good leaders are actually out there leading. So if you want to learn to be a leader, and there's a big caveat to what I'm saying there, and I'll explain it later, but if you want to learn to be a leader, get out under someone who can lead and take notice.
So is that just I'm trying to find the word here? Mentoring. Is that what you mean? Get under someone who is a good leader and form a mentoring relationship, or less formal than that?
Well, I think, look, in what I said before, I'm not saying education, the good leaders don't benefit from an education. But as I said, I think it's a hindrance. Formal mentoring partnerships could well be the way, or merely, if you want to be a good leader in a certain situation, go and work for someone that is a good leader and listen and watch. And that's the way we learn as children, and learn by your mistakes. When your leader comes and in whatever way, shape or form gives you a rip for poor performance, welcome it, because if you don't welcome critical comment, how are you going to know whether you're doing things right or wrong?
Yeah, okay. So here's another statement that I'd like to get your views on. Not a statement so much, more of a question. What do you think are going to be the most critical capabilities for leaders into the future? So based on your experience, what do you think leaders of the future need to have under their capability toolkit to be able to engage with the world of work?
Look, I think that it depends on what type of leader you want to be. I don't think there's going to be any change in the innate ability of leaders. The innate ability of leaders should be to have foresight, to be able to cope with unexpected incidents, the ability to surround themselves in good people to make up for their weaker areas, people management, but more so than everything, you can't be all things to all people. You've got to be discerning. And I've seen many good coaches coaching good teams, and it hasn't worked because the dynamic is not there. the club has chosen the players and then the coach. The coach didn't get an ability to choose the players that would perform in the manner that he would want them to perform. So it's difficult if you step in a leadership role in an organisation that has a culture that is a certain way, and that culture is the one that is inhibiting performance. You're going to have the devil's own job, because first you've got to change the culture to then become seen as an effective leader and point the direction. And some organisations, to change that inertia, it's very, very difficult. I've actually seen tremendous businessmen, a guy I used to play football with actually, running a very successful and very large business that his father had started and actually improving it, bought another business, and while their primary business went from strength to strength, the other one just continued along the trajectory that it was previously following and failed. The only way they could have changed it, I believe, was pretty much to divest themselves of 9/10 of the staff. But in today's climate, you can't do that. So if you've taken 50 years to develop a culture develops by default, you've got to be an absolute champion to change it in 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, okay. So here's one that hopefully won't throw you, and I know you'll have a view on this. Leaders are born, not made.
Crap.
Okay, all right.
No, in actual fact, I just want to say that to stir a bit. No, I believe that is a very true statement. And I'll give you an example. You will never, you can make a leader better, but you will never make a leader out of someone that doesn't have those capabilities. They may kind of get there, but they'll never do it. And if you look at, I always relate it to horses. If you're breaking a horse in and you spend hours and hours and days and weeks on that horse, you'll eventually end up with a horse that's half decent. But if it was a very poor horse at the start, performance-wise, there's a limit to what you'll achieve. If, however, you start with a very good horse and you put in the same amount of effort, you will end up with a horse that is streets ahead of what the other one was, or you can put in a fraction of the effort and still get the same result. So ultimately, the old saying, silk purse out of a sow's ear, I believe very strongly in that. There are some people that kid themselves that they can become a leader. There are people out there running training programs, and this may annoy some of your lecturers or whatever, convincing people that they can turn them into a leader. Not everyone can fly a jumbo jet. Remember that. So why do we accept that not everyone can do certain things, no matter how much training you give them? And yet we seem to think that if we train someone the right way, they can become a leader. Because the one thing that a person that is not a good leader doesn't have is the ability to see why they're not a good leader. And that ability is essential in a good leader. I know it sounds very circular. The reason I'm successful at what I'm doing now is because I was very good at seeing my failings, and I had many, and I have had to change them immeasurably. So the ability to self-critique is probably, you've got to have faith in yourself, but if you can't self-critique, you will never succeed to any great level.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. Look, and everyone views that very differently. I haven't heard too much that point, the last point you made about that being self-reflective or introspective about what it is that you do in your leadership travels, and I think that comes naturally to some people and not so naturally to others, because when you ask yourself the question that might rock your view of yourself, that can be difficult. Some people won't ever do it. I think it's a difficult thing to do. So My last question.
I'll cut in at this point, Eric.
Yeah. Yep.
I would ask many people that aspire to be leaders, how many times have they sat in front of someone and said, what do I do wrong? You know, do you think I can do this and why? And I will guarantee that many of them have never done it, or they've done it with close friends. And, close friends will never give you a direct answer because they are more worried about the loss of the friendship than about truth. But I have done it so many times, it's not funny. And I've done it with people whom I believe don't particularly like me, but they respect what I do. I use that term a lot. I believe it's a much misused and abused term, respect. A pair of drug dealers doing a fist bump and saying respect, there's probably a little bit of an abuse of the term. But ultimately, if you want to know about yourself, ask your critics.
Okay, yeah, that's great. So, last question for you, Martin. What might you say to a younger version of yourself? So, looking back at Martin in his teenage years, ready to take on the world, what would you say to him about what it is to be an effective leader?
I would say let your head harness your heart earlier on. I believe that my heart or my temper, it's an overused term again, my passion sort of thing, often overruled good sense. And it's only as I got older that I learned how to curb and control that. Every so often the horse bolts, still does, but I have experience enough to plug the leaks that are caused when it does. But as a younger person, I probably needed to learn that quicker. But there's a fine line between doing that and becoming mercenary and less than honest. I believe you've got to have principle. That doesn't mean that you won't fall beneath those principles. And many times I've done that. But unless you shoot high, unless you aim high, you're only gonna hit low, aren't you? So decide what your principles are. Try and control your emotion a little bit more. Channel it. But like I said, let your head harness your heart as soon as it possibly can.
Okay, and on that very positive note, I'd like to thank you, Martin, for joining me on what is my second foray into having a discussion around leadership, and I'm hoping people can draw something from this discussion because I have, and it's the reason I'm doing these, and I'll continue to do these, is that you can get so much information from the textbooks, you can get so much information from the massive amounts of literature on what leadership is or what good leadership should look like, but there's always something missing from that equation. And for me, it's being able to talk to people about what their pathway on leadership was and their views on it. So can I thank you again, Martin?
Pleasure's mine, mate. Always.
Thanks very much, and I'll catch everyone on the next podcast.